Hi there, I'll be talking today about one specific surveillance system available in the US, the National Violent Death Reporting System, or the NVDRS. So briefly, I'll open by talking about the epidemiology of violence and the history of the NVDRS, and then we'll talk about what data sources are part of it, the strengths and limitations of it, and we'll do a very quick example of one article, of a data point from an article that used the NVDRS. So let's start with the epidemiology of violence. Unintentional injuries are a leading cause of death in the US, so they are currently third overall. But for younger people, those age 1 to 44, unintentional injuries are actually the leading cause of death. And this is a pretty big class of types of injury. It includes things like unintentional poisoning, so that would include alcohol and drug overdoses, along with ingesting other types of poisonous substances. Motor vehicle crashes, falls, drownings, and also suicide and homicide. So that's sort of where part of the violence connection comes in. And since 1965, homicide and suicide have both been among the leading causes of death in the US. And we've seen pretty dramatic increases, although there have been a lot of fluctuations over time in those. But suicide in particular has been rising in terms of the overall list. So there's a link here at the bottom that if you have time, there's a nice animated picture from 1981 to 2018 looking at how various types of unintentional injuries have changed over that time period. And I also want to mention that violence wasn't really fully recognized as a public health issue until relatively recently. So things like child maltreatment and intimate partner violence were sort of seen as something that was private and not in the purview of public health. But because of the increases in things like suicide and homicide rates between 1950 and 1990, there became more public attention on the topic. So in 1983, the CDC established its violence epidemiology branch. And beginning in the 1990s, we really start to see evidence-based interventions developing for preventing violence. So where does the National Violent Death Reporting System come into all of this? Well, people started making calls for a firearm-related death surveillance system. The rationale for that was really that the leading causes of unintentional injury at the time in the US were traffic-related crashes, so motor vehicle crashes, and there was an existing reporting system for that in place. And so the second leading cause of injury-related deaths up through the early 2000s was firearm-related injuries. And so the logic was just, we have the motor vehicle one, now let's move to firearm-related injuries. So in 1994, CDC actually funded 6 states to do a firearm surveillance system, but that pretty quickly became very political. So in 1996, Congress pulled funding in the amount that was earmarked for those 6 states, and the Dickey Amendment prohibited CDC from spending funds to advocate for or promote gun control, which didn't specifically name this surveillance system, of course, but that was and has sort of been the interpretation. So in 1998, some private foundations joined together to try to do some work to get this surveillance system going. And in 2000, there was a meeting for plans for a revised surveillance system, which eventually became the National Violent Death Reporting System. So this really is a story of a public health success in terms of using a very broad partnership to affect policy change and to get the kind of data that we need to be able to make decisions, track these sorts of events. So the NVDRS partnership included law enforcement agencies and state public health agencies, along with some federal resources, including the Surgeon General and the Institute of Medicine. There were also a number of community-based organizations and practice-based organizations, clinical practice, along with politicians who were involved in this. And they created a pretty impressive set of things to go along with this campaign. So there was a report commissioned by the Institute of Medicine. The Surgeon General made some recommendations around suicide. There were public information campaigns, editorials written in newspapers. There were congressional briefings and other kinds of legislative work done through professional organizations. So all of that led to the successful creation of the NVDRS. So what is a violent death in the NVDRS? Well, it is a death that results from the unintentional use of physical force or power threatened or actual against oneself, another person, or a group or community. And these are based on ICD codes, which are what appear in death certificates. But the NVDRS actually goes beyond just death certificates, and there are data abstractors that assign the manner of death. So this gives you a sense of the types of ICD codes included. So suicide and homicide, along with other kinds of undetermined intent deaths, would be reviewed by the abstractor. And then things like firearms are still part of this, but they're not the only thing included in the NVDRS. And there is a specific code for legal intervention. And then terrorism is also included. So you might recall from the definition against groups for people as part of the definition. So that's where terrorism sort of fits in. So in 2002, the CDC sponsored the first set of states, I believe it was 6, to start collecting data. And it was a relatively, there was kind of a slow addition over the last few years of more and more states to the system. I think in 2006, there were 16 of them. And then as of 2020, all 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico, are collecting data through the NVDRS. So it is a state and territory-based system, but CDC aggregates the data. So it includes information about deaths related to child maltreatment and intimate partner violence, also homicides more broadly, and suicide. And then, as I noted before, there's specific classifications for law enforcement related deaths, firearm related deaths, and then undetermined or other kinds of deaths. And as we noted, this kind of starts with death certificate information and ICD codes, but the NVDRS's strength is that it also incorporates law enforcement data, crime lab reports, and medical examiner or coroner reports. So a lot more detailed information than death certificates alone provide, and those abstractors going through and assigning codes really provides a much stronger system of information. So in addition to details about the death itself or the specific type of death, there's a lot of information that we get about the circumstances around the event, toxicology results if they're available, and some fair amount of demographic information about the person who died, including whether or not they were a veteran, for example. These data are available. They're in a searchable form through CDC's Whiskers website. And then there have also been a few notable publications to date that kind of describe the system. And there's a list of published papers on the CDC's website. So I just want to mention one paper, one result that kind of exemplifies what you can do with data from the NVDRS. So this paper had really two functions. It was comparing the NVDRS to vital statistic reports alone and supplementary homicide reports, so some of the sources that go into the NVDRS. Again, noting that the differences of NVDRS actually has human beings sitting and coding things as well. So that's not the part I'm going to focus on, but I'm going to focus on the kind of content of this article, the topic area it focused on, which was homicides by police. And so it used these multiple data sources to compare them, but also to make an estimate at the state level for the states that were involved at the time between 2005 and 2012, but also to look at differences in police, law enforcement involved homicides by race and ethnic groups. And so this is helpful for, we've had an ongoing discussion in this country for many years, but really more intense one, more public one in recent years about whether or not there are differences in, for example, police involved shootings based on one's race and ethnicity. And so the value of this article is to demonstrate that, yes, it's not just that we're hearing about it more or that it's more common that these are documented. In fact, if you look at vital statistics records and law enforcement data, we see this top line, the solid black line represents non-Hispanic Black decedents. And so that rate per 100,000 population, so this is adjusted for population size, is indeed higher than it is for Hispanic or non-Hispanic white individuals who've died. So in other words, non-Hispanic Black adults are more likely to die in a law enforcement related homicide than other racial and ethnic groups. So the NVDRS does have both strengths and limitations like any data source. Strengths include that it is incorporating vital statistics data, so that's that information is collected primarily from coroners or medical examiners. Then it's supplemented with homicide reports that agencies submit to the FBI that include more details. And again, it has multiple data sources and a person who sits and codes the information to make sure it's accurate. Weaknesses are that there are some types of things, some types of incidents that aren't reportable or don't generate the type of report that gets collected in the NVDRS. And that varies a little bit by state and whether or not somebody's on federal property. So there are a few instances where people might be excluded from the NVDRS as a result. Also, supplementary homicide reports are voluntary and they're classified by where the death happened, not where the person resides. So that can just complicate the linkage somewhat. And as I said, it was just this year that all states started collecting data, so the data aren't available yet for all states, but they will be soon. And one last limitation is that the police report data can't be incorporated until the case is closed. So there are situations where that creates a long lag, and so the data may not be completely accurate at the time that it's released. Nonetheless, the NVDRS, again, is an excellent data source for all kinds of violent deaths in public health. Provides us a lot of the descriptive epidemiology information we need to start doing more analytic work and understand the impact of violent deaths in communities.